That day in the office that I ended up in the emergency room, there was a transference of energy between myself and my peer that I was working with and had took to her psychiatric appointment. That setting didn't allow for me to use my shamanic gifts because I was confined by the rules of pathological medicine, and I was solely serving from the container of a Western mind frame. Once I was in the emergency holding room, I was able to get to my phone and call my spiritual teacher to explain the situation. The nurses told me I had to take off my sacred beads, and all of a sudden, an African doctor enters the room, and he was of Nigerian descent, and immediately I felt a sense of relief. I told him that I couldn't take off my beads because of my spiritual practice, and he affirmed that I didn't have to. He was immensely patient with me. He listened to my story, and our interaction was completely opposite from the intake doctor. He agreed to speak to my spiritual teacher, and after his assessment and a few hours in the ER, he released me to go home. So this experience was quite a shock to me. I had already been a Sangoma for a year, but I'm still a baby, and always will be a baby in terms of this learning spirit. But I was pulled back in time to 5 years prior to my experience as a mental health patient, and it reminded me of how important it is to educate people and professionals about spiritual emergency. And I was conflicted as to why this was happening to me at this time and stage in my life after yet what a particular point that came up for me is that I could never forget where I came from, and it forced me into knowing that I had to work from a place of the spiritual understanding that I had acquired and that I had gained through my own personal transformation. So from that moment on, I quit my job, and I started to work as a full-time Sangoma and headed for the mountains. And, a little bit about how I'm answering the call today. There's, I have a mental health scholarship fund, which is absolutely depleted, but I continue to take people that need service as much as I possibly can. In embracing those people with warm and open hearts. Also, I have a shamanic program called Embracing the Spiritual the Gift. It's a shamanic journeying program, and I have a lot of people that deal with mental health that come for that work. And the long-term goal is to have a shamanic healing center in a recovery clinic where it's peers and therapists that are really connected to shamanic work and also shamanic healers where we can all come together and be of service to the community in a different way. So thank you very much, and I will open it up for any questions.
I'm a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, so I may be a little sensitive about the way psychiatrists are generally portrayed. And I think that the vision that you've set out is quite compatible with psychoanalysis, for example, where a psychoanalysis is a journey. One encounters, in the Freudian tradition, one's personal unconscious and is visited by memories and spirits and forces, if you want to use that metaphor. And Jung would say that one is visited by the collective unconscious, something beyond the individual. And I think the notion of spirit ancestors is something that's yet beyond that it's a world that visits the individual. So I think all of that is perfectly compatible, and people could choose a practitioner and a practice that fit well with their personal development and probably achieve similar goals. I don't see how this is compatible with sort of Western medicine, Western culture in the sense, because when you collapsed in the clinic, or if someone were to collapse on the street, one would need a culture where the public could make a distinction between this is a spiritual collapse or this person has epilepsy, or in the emergency room. This is a spiritual collapse or an emergency. And in order to do that, there would either have to be a tremendous education and agreement in the general culture about how to make a differential diagnosis between these things, or there would have to be spiritual healers either in place or on call to emergency settings, because in our society, that's where people who collapse are taken.
Yeah.
And if there's no spiritual integration in the emergency setting, doctors are going to do what they've been trained to do, which is to take x-rays, do their differential diagnosis, and then you were treated in the way people are traditionally treated in Western differential diagnosis.
Yes, thank you.
But suppose psychoanalysis would reach into the spiritual, per se, and defy Freud on that score.
I don't believe that. I personally don't believe that there is a separate spirit world. I believe that...
No, there's one inside us.
You believe that. So.
The spiritual world is part of the Seelenn that Freud originally talked about. S-E-E-L-Y-E. And it's a part of psychoanalysis we need to explore in this latter day situation of ours.
That's a complicated remark.
Well, thank you for sharing that, and I also agree that it's difficult because, when I was at the office and I went to the floor, nobody knew that it was a spiritual thing. The paramedic, it's a little shaky, but they had to take me to the emergency room, and that's important and it's needed. And I'm not discounting that it doesn't need to happen, but I do agree that, like even with the example that I made earlier, that there's more spiritual outlets for people like us, where people can go to. You have the chaplain usually in the hospital, but it'll be great to open up those doors to like the other hospital that had the Buddhist monk and maybe a shaman there, and say, hey, which of these do you identify with? Let's have somebody come in and help you as we help you, and be of service to them in that way.
How did you get the African doctor?
Oh, how did I find her?
I thought the African doctor came to you in the hospital.
She did not. I was, there's a part of my story that's in the film that I was looking for something, and I was actually led to her, and I found her, and we did a Skype divination, and I just told her my maternal and paternal names, and then she read my life for the last, since I was a child to that moment, and by the end of the reading, I was in tears, literally. She had really confirmed all the things that I had been feeling for such a long time. And she said that you're called to initiate. You're not crazy. You actually have gifts. And she's also was born here in America, but she went to South Africa to do her training and was also called by her ancestors as well. Then there was a question way in the back there. And we have about 4 minutes, so I'll try to take as many as I can.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just something that was said a few minutes ago about, I think, the challenge that you're posing to us, just in the material you're discussing. And maybe it's been said already, but do you see what it reminds me of is the transmission of trauma intergenerationally, and also something stuck in my ear when you were talking about someone taking someone's history, and I think you said asking about what the ancestors had encountered. We take medical histories, right? What were these illnesses? But I don't know that we pay attention to what these kind of unresolved traumatic
Historical
encounters.
traumas, yeah. Yeah.
And the ways in which they show up and intrude and return in various and new traumatic ways. Does that resonate with you?
Absolutely. you know, I was in a particular journey where I had ancestors that had came through the transatlantic slave trade that were, their chains were still attached to their ankles, and they were it's a little sensitive because it's just coming, but they were still chained, and those ancestors really affected me in this physical realm. We say as above, so below. What is happening in the spiritual realm can be manifested in this realm. And so those ancestors needed to be attended to know that they didn't have to be in the shackles anymore. That energy still played on and on repeatedly through my bloodline and through my DNA. And so we have to pay attention to those things as well. Okay, so they just asked me to stop the Q&A, but I will be around, and I thank you so much.